is that the amendment be disagreed to, and I give the call to the honourable member for Goldstein.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. And like many members, it's a privilege to be able to speak on this bill and its critical importance to the national security of our country. When it comes to legislation that deals with the challenges of national security, there's generally a good spirit of bipartisan support in this chamber for the simple basis that it's not just an issue of which we have common purpose, and of course we should, but also one that is relatively free of the different philosophical divisions between members and what brings them to this chamber. Because, if anything else, if your pursuit of wanting to defend Australia, its interests and, of course, the safety and security of its citizens is not part of your core objective and core belief, then the question should be asked, what is it that you are doing here? In saying that, that doesn't mean that we believe in unlimited restrictions on our liberty or our freedom as a consequence of national security legislation. And in fact, I think it's one of the areas in which this parliament can be very proud of its important work in finding that sense of balance. In other countries, including some that are Five Eyes partners or even other broader alliances, it isn't always clear that they strike that balance, both because they don't start from a position of saying the importance of security and freedom of the individual is of critical importance, but that in the end they want to seek to empower agencies and government to provide a false surety because they feel that they can justify it as a means to fiddle in the affairs of their citizens. That is not our way, that will not be our way, and it should not be our way. Our balance should be to focus on what we need to do to keep, yes, Australians safe, but critically to keep them free. It's one of the great principles that underpins the strength of our country. And this bill is consistent with that provision because so often when we seek to introduce legislation that does have a constraint on liberty, often for those that are target of investigation by our various agencies, from domestic police forces all the way through to agencies that have a broader responsibility beyond our shores, is we put in sunset provisions and restrictions which make sure that they're reviewed regularly by this parliament, so there isn't a needless encroachment on people's freedom, and that if there is, that there's proper accountability, and also to address the reality that legislation often has to be reviewed against the framework of changing circumstances, both from adversaries and, of course, those who wish our nation ill, but also against the backdrop of changing technology and the need to be contemporary and relevant to the threats that Australia faces. And what this legislation does is looks at some of the bigger challenges we have in terms of foreign conflict, for example, particularly around our foreign fighters legislation and the need to continue declared area offences associated with foreign fighters. Now, this is a controversial part of law, Deputy Speaker. We reviewed it recently by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, of which I'm a member. And I continue to have philosophical challenges with this provision of law, the idea that we're going to declare areas where it's illegal essentially to go in the world and simply by the mere presence of an Australian citizen in that location they commit a crime. And this is why we should review this legislation regularly and be brought back. Is it still fit for purpose? Is it being utilised properly by our agencies and through the directives of the minister? Are they seeking to use or abuse these very critical powers? Now, I think we can take a high degree of confidence with how they have been implemented, but that is, of course, how this government has done so. It needn't mean that other governments in the future may not do so, and there is a need to continue to review the basis of the legislation, its efficacy in the 21st century, and whether it also sets precedents for other areas of law as well. That, of course, goes in terms of other provisions within the bill around the renewal of the control orders regime around terrorist acts for foreign incursion, for managing the risk posed by persons who continue to present a risk to the community. The preventive detention orders are an important tool in preventing an imminent terrorist attack and preserve vital evidence in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. Emergency stop search and seizure powers that ensure police are able to respond consistently and effectively to terrorist incidents or threats. And of course that all of these provisions have not just the capacity for our agencies to be able to do their job, though they do, but also heavy restrictions around their use, including protections for people's liberty, and they're targeted and utilised appropriately. More importantly, as part of the broader artifice of our national security framework, not just around the safeguards we provide around these types of powers that are given, we also not just send them through this parliament for renewal so that we can be confident around their operational use, but we also have, as members may be aware, quite a sophisticated architecture around the ongoing operation of this legislation so that it's used appropriately and that there's proper oversight of its day-to-day use. Of course, we have the IGIS, the Inspector General Intelligence and Security, with the standing powers of a Royal Commission to make sure that if there is misuse of power, that it's identified, that those held are accountable, it's transparent about its abuse either to the public and or to the Parliamentary Joint Committee in Intelligence Security. Of course, there's the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, who looked at some of these provisions around their ongoing extension, their justification. And the Insulin's job is to continually review laws in the national security space for our country, and in doing so assess whether they're fit for purpose and what needs to be amended or updated or subtracted. And we need to make this critically clear, Deputy Speaker, or subtracted from the framework of laws because they have reached their use-by date or no longer serve a practical purpose. And of course, all of those matters are oversight as well by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence Security, of which, as I mentioned before, I'm a member, who do far more inquiries sometimes than our diaries allow, but ensures that we are regularly reviewing the proper evidence base for the continuation of these laws, how they operate, and of course the agencies that seek to implement them. And while there are many things in this chamber that we will strongly and vehemently disagree with, Deputy Speaker, and sometimes I'm at the fore of those disagreements, the collegiality, even in disagreement and seeking to query the basis of these laws through the PJCIS, is something that members can take a great deal of comfort in. As somebody said to me, it has literally every part of the philosophical spectrum that sits upon it. In fact, I would say that there's a healthy number of civil libertarians currently on the committee offering their own feedback and advice on legislations that come through, and sometimes, much to, I suspect, the minister's chagrin, there is requests for not just amendments, but more critically sometimes for the wholesale renewal and reapproach towards legislation to make sure that it's fit for purpose and it's protecting Australian citizens' interests, their freedom, and against the backdrop, of course, of genuine and sincere national security threats. And we work as a committee through those pieces of legislation methodically, pragmatically, in partnership with, of course, those who seek to implement it on behalf of Australians. I know that the work that the committee does is then highly regarded by this parliament, because invariably when the PJCIS makes a recommendation, both because of the members on both sides of the chamber that are participants, it's generally taken as a given that that should be the broad basis of law. Of course, sometimes there will be minor amendments and sometimes there will be disagreement both between the committee, the parliament and, of course, the government. That is in nature sometimes because of access to further information that may come about. But the basis of it remains the same, and that is something that we can all take a high degree of confidence in its work, and more critically in the advice that's then provided to this parliament about the passage of legislation. But make no mistake, Deputy Speaker, the bill before us today is one of critical urgence and importance. The Morrison government's first task above all else is to keep Australians secure and safe. And the threats that are posed to us as a nation through the risks of counter-terrorism, cyber-attacks, and of course other threats remains real, and something that we must stay on top of as a nation if we wish to be able to be confident of securing our national interest and of course the health, safety and well-being of the Australian people. And of course these threats will continue into the future, most of which we do not invite upon ourselves at all, but nonetheless we must be in a position to respond to, because those people who wish us harm need to be met with the full confidence of the Australian people and its government and its agencies to defend our way of life, our nation and our national interests. And we make no apology for standing up strongly in doing so, because the first basis of any citizen's freedom is, of course, their personal security. And when that is threatened, they are not just threatened, we are not just threatened, but of course, Deputy Speaker, the nation is threatened as well. I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the member for Gold.